Hello. Well, we've all seen the pictures of police bullying old people who are protesting against the COVID lockdowns and that sort of thing. But I want to tell you a story in which you can see that official bullying, this is a golden opportunity for official bullying. You might call this the golden age of official bullying in the 21st century. And this is a story that happened to one of my sons. As is the case with many in London, he's been working a lot from home and he's been doing a lot of mail order shopping as well. And that means a lot of cardboard boxes. Now, generally speaking, my son, and I'll refer to him for the purposes of this video as Peter, he puts the boxes in the green he collapses and leaves them out for a couple of days and they get wet, and then he shoves them in the green recycling bin. And every 2 weeks the council comes round in an extravagantly decorated, subcontracted behemoth of a van which says, look how we take care of the environment and recycle everything, and look how easy we make it for you to do that. Remember that, because this is important a bit further on down the story. And they come and pick up the green bins. Now, they are under instructions just to take the green bins. You wheel them, or they wheel them to the behemoth, and then the behemoth lifts it up and tips it in and swallows the lot. But sometimes there's more. And although the men themselves aren't allowed to take anything that isn't in the green bins, they will on occasion allow my son Peter, and no doubt others, to throw something else in if it's not too much. Now, on this occasion, Peter had a lot of boxes. And there was one of those situations where you couldn't really even collapse them because he had a sort of babushka stack of boxes inside the other. And he asked them if he could throw one of these boxes, or a couple of these boxes, into the van. And they said they couldn't allow it because it had been a heavy week for cardboard boxes, not only in Peter's family, but in the entire neighbourhood. And the van was already filling up and they couldn't take anything beyond their remit. So Peter had to keep the boxes in the back garden, and some of the dry ones were in the sitting room. And finally, Peter's wife, who for the purposes of this video I shall call Charlotte, said she couldn't stand it anymore. They live in a small London terrace house with a back garden that hardly qualifies for the name. I think it's probably not much bigger than their living room. And the kids, it's big enough for a trampoline for the kids, and that's about it. And they have children, and the children were climbing over the boxes in the living room, and that they were disintegrating in the back garden. And, well, Charlotte was getting increasingly irritated by it. I don't think she would object to me telling everyone that Charlotte is a very tidy housekeeper. She's extremely orderly, and all this disorder was driving her up the wall. And it would drive even me up the wall, and I'm hardly a paragon of tidiness. So on Thursday evening, she gave Peter an ultimatum. Those boxes had to go. And Peter promised he'd get rid of them that weekend. And to that end, he actually loaded up his car that very night with a whole load of boxes, filling the entire back of the car. Then on Saturday morning, he went to the recycling site to get rid of them. He got to the site, it was completely empty. There was a barrier down and a kiosk next to it, and it was obviously open, but nobody else had got there yet. And he could see through the glass of the kiosk that there was a man in a yellow jacket inside there. So he went up to the barrier, and after a couple of minutes, a yellow jacket came out of the kiosk. He was obviously very busy. And he came out and he had this clipboard, and Peter greeted him. And the man was obviously, he greeted him back, but he was obviously fascinated by the contents of the clipboard because he didn't lift his eyes from it. And after a while, he did lift his eyes and said to Peter, "Your registration number isn't on my list." And Peter said, "What list is that?" And Yellow Jacket said, "You have to book a slot." And Peter observed, "But it's empty." "Oh, those are the rules," says Yellow Jacket. "COVID, you have to book a slot." "How do I do that?" said Peter. "Online," responded Yellow Jacket. So Peter backed his car from the barrier, just parked at the entrance, and went online on his phone to book a slot. Now, he saw in the online form that whereas most of the rest of the week the slots were pretty well booked up, it just so happened that on that Saturday there were hardly any people coming to the amenity site to throw away rubbish. And neither before his time there or after it for an hour or so, there were no bookings. So he got to work booking the slot for the time he was there. He went through all the procedures to book for that morning, but when he clicked on the final button, the button that said "Book Now," it was greyed out. So he got out of the car and went to the kiosk and held his phone up to the window and showed Yellow Jacket what was going on and said, "Look, I'm trying to book online, but it won't give me the option to finalise the transaction." "That's because you have to book a week ahead, mate," responded Yellow Jacket. But it's empty here," protested Peter. "Those are the rules, mate. COVID. Nothing I can do about it." "Well, what do I do now?" asked Peter. "Well, you could try ringing," suggested Yellow Jacket. So Peter went back to his car and rang the number given on the website. As he rang the phone, he saw Yellow Jacket's arm reach forward to pick up the phone in his booth. And then when the connection went through, he heard that same man saying, "Hello?" And Peter asked, "Are you the same gentleman I was just talking to in the amenity site, the one who suggested I could ring to book a slot?" And there was a little silence. And then Yellow Jacket, for indeed it was he, said, "It might be. Then again, it might not." And Peter said, "Well, can I book a slot for this morning?" And Yellow Jacket responded, "You can't book for this morning, week in advance, mate. COVID." At which point Peter knew he'd been beaten thoroughly and comprehensively. He drove away. But he also knew he couldn't go back home with those boxes. In the millennia-old tradition of the hunter who goes out and promises his woman back at the cave that he'd return that evening with an antelope for dinner, he had to get rid of those boxes. He was so desperate, he was even fantasizing about shoving them into other people's bins on his way home. But then he remembered there's a big Sainsbury's at some distance from where he was, which meant he was using more petrol to get there. So much for ecological care. And this Sainsbury's had the big recycling containers, and he knew some of them said they took cardboard. So he decided to make for that supermarket It was still early enough for there to be room in the car park and space in the containers. So we drove over to that Sainsbury's, and indeed the car park was almost empty, and there were the recycling containers standing there. Great big metal things, and some of them saying, "We take cardboard," and every single one of them with an access slot about that big, about the size of a letter plate. And so my son spent the next 40 minutes tearing those boxes into strips and feeding them into the recycling bits, a piece at a time. 40 minutes of his time, a lot of energy wasted, and absolutely no benefit to anyone. So let's take away a moral from this story. Well, apart from the fact that our council says it's very environmentally responsible when it isn't, and the fact that it's not running the recycling site efficiently on our money, we're paying for this amenity site. It's also obvious that these COVID restrictions don't just apply to some police bullying. They are a petty official's wet dream, and they are going to fight tooth and nail to maintain that status quo, because for them it is all too much fun. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Granni design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.granniopteryx.com, and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.